Guten Morgen. Welcome to this session. There is a saying in Filipino, you might want to hear the natural sound of the language. Ulan, bagyo, baha. It means rain, storm, flood. So this morning we are going to talk about rain, storm, and flood because the topic is about climate. I was told that there is some sense of controversy when talking about the whole phrase climate change. And therefore, I will leave it to our panelists to explain what that controversy is. They will have 8 minutes to talk about the topic, after which we will open the floor to questions for 10 minutes. And are you ready? Yeah, jawohl. Okay, so our first speaker is Renato Redentor. Oh, I'm sorry. Our first speaker is Professor Marge Evasco. She's often referred to as a dream weaver after the title of her first poetry book. She is from Bohol and very proud of it, but she has also lived in many other islands in the Philippines and describes herself as semi-nomadic. She earned her graduate and postgraduate degrees and published several books of poetry, books on oral history, biography, and art. She has traveled far and wide and has experienced a lot of climate changes. She is also Professor Emeritus of Literature and a university fellow at the De La Salle University, Manila, where she taught for 35 years with the literature department. She serves as a distinguished professor and writer in residence. She will talk about climate from her point of view as an organizer of a community that deals with, climate. Okay, let's give her a big hand.
Thank you very much, Nick. Maayong buntag kanatong tanan. Guten Tag, everyone. I'm happy to share with you 2 ongoing initiatives I am part of on writing the environment. And I'm coming from my experience as a writer who teaches creative writing in the academe as well as in the communities that I work with. Can we have slide 2, please? And these initiatives are, number 1, the IAS LaSalle National Writers Workshop. IAS means seed. It's a language from the Western Visayas. It's Hiligaynon. And this is held every April in the University of St. LaSalle in Bacolod City. And the second initiative is Dagat Bohol, Kinabuhi o Panginabuhi sa mga mananagat, a reciprocal learning and collaborative writing workshop between master artisanal fishermen and young writers of selected coastal towns of my home province, Bohol. Next slide, please. In 2016, 2 years after the publication of the groundbreaking anthology, Agam, Filipino Narratives on Uncertainty and Climate Change, the Bienvenido and Santos Creative Writing Center of De La Salle University forged a partnership with the Institute of Climate and Sustainable Cities, then under the leadership of Red Constantino, to foster IAS workshops bid to advocate for writing the environment. Next. This advocacy partnership began in 2017, and while we were not sure if there would be enough young writers for the workshop fellowships, to our surprise, young writers from various disciplines and writing in 5 Philippine languages, Hiligaynon, Kinaraya, and Akyanon of the Western Visayas, Binisaya of the Central Visayas and parts of Mindanao, Filipino, and English, came to IAS with their stories, poems, creative nonfiction, and play. For 9 years now, we have read, discussed, and discussed the submitted drafts with care and concern for the craft of writing as part of our care and concern for the care of the environment. veering away from the problematic practice of using the environment as a passive setting for the human drama in literature, or using more than human beings as metaphorical extensions of human feelings. We have seen that young writers were more agile in the necessary mind shift for environment writing by decentering the human ego and breaking the dominant hierarchy with the human ways always on the top of the food chain. We have witnessed that the annual IAS lectures that Read Constantino gives these young writers goads them to think of important environmental provocations towards epistemic creative activism. Next year, we will be clocking a decade of this advocacy as IAS celebrates its 25 years. And it will be marked by the PILAC, or Silver Anthology of Writing the Environment. Can we have the next slide, please? In 2023, sparked by the essay titled Towards a Curriculum of Belonging, as well as by the AGAM agenda, When is Now, creative writing workshop of the Institute of Climate and Sustainable Cities, which taught secondary school students in Giwan, Samar how to care for their marine environment, I decided a creative writing workshop for my home island, Bohol, that would gather around the community table, master artisanal fishermen as seasoned elders of a coastal community, willing to sit with a handful of young writers to tell their stories, and then afterwards to listen to the poems, songs, and stories crafted by these young writers, giving them advice on how to improve their drafts and how to put what they had learned into action. I broached the concept of the workshop to other published Boholano writers who I invited to comprise the project team. And they were just as inspired and curious as I was to see how the pedagogy would work and what we would learn from the experience. You see, the usual way is for the PhDs to be in the center of the table and then do all the talking. And we said, what if we put ourselves deliberately on the margins and just let things happen? So that was our great experiment. And before we talked, the Boholano writers read from Avis's essay that articulates a decolonial strategy based on the experience of India of crafting a curriculum for belonging. Aves points out that the colonial education delivered in the language of the colonizer teaches young writers, young learners, a one-size-fits-all curriculum of X habitation, which effectively, sometimes irreparably, severs their ties from their communities, their immediate communities, and and the environment, resulting to a devaluing of their own communities' knowledge systems and metabolizing the belief in the superiority of the colonizers' epistemology. Filipino novelist Gina Apostol, in a craft lecture on the writing of her novel, La Tercera, she was at De La Salle University in 2024, she stated that colonial epistemicide continues even now in the Philippines, and that it is time for Filipino writers to learn, to write, to think in their native languages, with their own communities, reclaiming the rich knowledge systems of their culture and environment. The urgency of this work in the Philippines is heightened by the problems of cultural and environmental losses wrought by the extractive capitalism in mining, logging, commercial fishing, and the so-called development projects all over the archipelago. The Dagat Bohol project team wanted to see how the young writers in junior and senior high, ages 18 to 20, would gain valuable knowledge from the experience of their elders, knowledge with which they would reaffirm their fundamental connection with the culture of their coastal communities in their marine environment through research-based writing, not in the school-learned and legislated English or Filipino, but in their mother tongue, Binisayang Bolanon, which is a variant of the Cebuano-Visayan language used in the Visayas and Mindanao. The pedagogical challenge then was how to put in place a cultural inhabitation process beyond the traditional classroom, a re-immersion experience where young writers can wean themselves from the dominant use of English to learn or relearn in their specific local community's language from and with elders of their coastal communities. The value learning what the schools don't offer in the curriculum. One of the ways of responding to the pedagogical challenge was then to bring a handful of young writers to a cultural space, an environment where they could listen to and learn from the stories of their elders, and guided and informed by these stories, write new poems, riddles, songs, stories, creative nonfiction narratives, and essays in their local language. What was crucial was also to find artisanal fishermen who would be willing to come to the table and share their gifts of experiential knowledge freely as provisions for the young writers' continuing journey through life. And we were grateful to meet Teogenes B. Pellegrino and Paquito M. Absede, who understood the importance of their role as mentors. Their combined years of fishing experience and knowledge of the Bohol Sea was really impressive, very impressive. They had mastered the skills of making their own fishing gear and instruments needed to survive at sea. And they knew their essential work in providing food for their families and their communities. Moreover, they were leaders of their local communities, eager to connect with young people who might benefit from their knowledge and skills. During the June 10, 2023 orientation, their meeting with the writers, they articulated their perception of their own marginal position in the discourse of knowledge in society, as though what they knew about the sea was not important at all. Thus, they welcomed the chance to be able to speak and heard. Their willingness to take part in the project was from their belief that they had something important to share with the young writers and with us, but that they had never ever been given any forum before where their knowledge and experience were heard and taken seriously. All of the 6 young writers who committed to participating in the project were fluent in speaking Boholano Binisaya. They expressed their eagerness to try writing in their mother tongue. So it was the first experience for them because they were writing in English and in Filipino. Moreover, they realized that the writing in Boholano Binisaya would enable them to communicate directly and effectively with their elders, the 2 master artisanal fishermen, who would in turn be able to listen to them and share what they had written and give them feedback. So the feedback did not come from the PhD holders. The feedback came from our fishermen. And the fishermen told them how they had engaged with the stories, interpreted the stories from real experience, as well as they inspired them to give and share these works with their own families and barangay communities. So eliminating the artificial language divide wrought by the dominant English language ensured a more open exchange between the young writers and the fishermen. Let me end by sharing some of the riddles that these young writers had made. As Visayans, they all grew up in a community playing the game of tigmo, or riddle. So the riddles in our culture, they are used to sharpen our observation of nature with wit and humor through defamiliarization. They enjoyed making the new riddles and played the game with the fishermen and with everyone in the call and response game. Usually, it begins with the ritual verse where the first riddler chants, and this is capped by the question what it is. It goes, tigmo. Can we have the next slide so we can, yeah. Tigmo, tigmo agukoy, ugma rata mag-asoy, Unsa man bi? So it means riddle, riddle, hermit crab. Tomorrow we will tell. What is it then? And so the first one that gives the answer becomes the next riddler. So it's a cycle of riddles. So here you have the second one. It says, daw ballpen nga may tinta, dili magamit sa pagmarka. Like a ballpen with ink can't be used for marking. And the answer is, of course, squid, nokos. Lansang kun tawagon, apan maprito ug makaon. Unsa man bi? And then the tubag is buad bulinaw, na? Nails, they're called, but they can be fried and eaten. Answer, sun-dried anchovy, which we all love, I think, for breakfast, right? And then the last one is daghang hait nga ngipon, apan mahadlok kun paakon. Unsa man bi? And then the answer would be iho. Has plenty of sharp teeth, but is afraid to be bitten. And the answer is shark. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor. One of the general themes of this session is how do we write about climate change? And I might answer we should write it with urgency. So our next speaker is Renato Redentor Constantino. He is the managing director of the Constantino Foundation, which works to promote integrative pedagogy using art and literature to promote a usable history. He has been an advocate of climate change in terms of policy and diplomacy, spanning East, South, and East Asia, North America, and Europe. He is currently Special Envoy to the Secretary General of the Climate Vulnerable Forum and its V20 group of finance ministers. Mr. Constantino is behind what might be the world's first literary anthology on climate change. So there is an intersect between his job as a his policy making skills, his policy advocacy, and his climate advocacy in terms of literature. His anthology is entitled Agam, Filipino Narratives on Uncertainty and Climate Change, and its international sequel, Harvest Moon, Poems and Stories from the Edge of the Climate Crisis. Together, it has won 7 National Book Awards. Congratulations. He is the author of The Poverty of Memory, Essays on History and Empire. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Constantino.
Maraming salamat. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum. Warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, everyone. This should be a good discussion, so I will jump right into our topic. As our moderator had explained, apart from living with history and studying it and advocating for it, I've also spent 3 decades working on international climate policy. I mention that as a source of authority because the next words might be controversial, so I'm not just pulling it out of my nose. We can safely say that we recognize that the climate crisis is the biggest crisis the world has ever faced. That's a fact. But I would also say, in the same vein, that it is not necessarily the most important issue. For families who feel that food on the table, jobs, shelter, clothing, good health, education, those are just as important, if not more important. And in that space is where literature should be able to thrive. Because unless we're going to embark on literature that simply mines victimhood and disaster porn, then we do not communicate anything, especially not of the future. I would also say very much that in my 3 decades of work, having looked at or having been the recipient of my children's description who tell their parents that we have a doomsday day job looking at the climate crisis. We've seen spreadsheets from 20 years ago looking at the potential of Africa and the Amazon to become savannas in a few decades because of warming temperatures. I would say in absolute terms that in terms of the climate crisis, science and policy are absolutely essential, but they're also absolutely insufficient. And that has been proven again and again and again in my country, the Philippines, but also in many other places. I think including in countries in Europe, especially in Germany. We need more poetry, we need more literature, and we need more history. For example, most people assume that the crisis is because of fossil fuels, correct? And they often trace it to key moments like the oil crisis of the 1970s, the Iran-Iraq war, and so on. But if you delve a little bit more into history, you would realize that the Paris Agreement of 2015, the climate treaty, also can be traced back to its roots in the Treaty of Paris, where the US bought the Philippines and Cuba from Spain for the price of $20 million. For what? For empire, for power, for control. And so if you cannot discuss climate change without discussing colonialism and imperialism, then you're going to meet a dead end again and again and again. Especially when you realize that at the turn of the 20th century, late 19th century, the warships from the US that were brought to the Philippines were powered by coal. In fact, Filipinos still call big seafaring vessels as vapor without realizing that the word comes from vapor, which is from steam. And steam is produced by burning coal. So the warships that came over actually established a lot of things, including US bases that many fought in the Philippines, without realizing that Guantanamo, the first so-called concentration camp for the war on terror, was first a coaling station in Cuba. And the Subic Naval Base, before it became the largest overseas military base of the US, was first a coaling station as well. And so you trace fossil fuel conflict not from oil, but from coal. And if you trace it in that manner, you see that in between is 1,000 stories waiting to be written without requiring disaster porn or poverty or victimhood. You see stories that will well up from history from our common past. Next slide, please. This is also why, as our moderator had mentioned, at some point we just threw a tantrum and said, we will have to create our own literature where there's none. And so Agam was produced just like Harvest Moon was produced a decade later. And it was a maddening process for many, but for us it was very fulfilling because we gave rules that drove our writers very, some of them nuts, others like Marge understood immediately what was needed because we told our writers and our photographers that we would create books that would be multiple languages. Agam was composed of 8 languages, and Harvest Moon was composed of 11 languages, including Kankanay, Binisaya by Marge, Turkish, Zapoteca, Chinese, French, and Spanish. And we told the writers that you have received in your email a packet, one of which is a 5-page single-spaced document that lists down words that you are forbidden to use, such as climate change, such as temperature, such as global warming. Do not use any of the crutch words, the crutch jargon that have served to distance the public from what is supposed to be the most urgent issue that we're facing today. And I think they've done really quite well. Agam is already out of print. Harvest Moon is soon going to be out of print as well. And it's a challenge not only to the scientific and policy community, but also to the literary world, to recreate the conditions by which people are able to locate their stories in the midst of the politics of denial, betrayal, and of dithering, of the lack of courage or of rank cowardice among so-called world leaders who would rather spend billions and trillions of dollars for more wars rather than face what might be our common annihilation, not of the world, but just of the humans, erasing ourselves from our own history, from this planet. Because the world will endure. Humankind, we're not sure. We can be so stupid. So if you can go to the next slide, please. It's the reason also why, particularly in our work, we have managed to convince a lot of high officials. The picture you see in front of you is a conundrum, is a riddle, because it's a picture of one of the annual conferences that we hold in the groups that I work with, an annual conference of finance ministers from 72 countries. And they're supposed to be the most conservative agency in any government, in any country. And yet they chose, for instance, in this year, they chose for the title of the theme of their conference, When is Now, which Marge was involved with. When is Now is the name of the global poetry rebellion that a couple of young people put together. And they chose that because they knew that policy was not going to be enough. And they needed a clarion call to sound not just the issues that we were confronting, but also the action that we needed immediately. Next slide, please. Why immediate? Because it's not just the living that is under threat. These are pictures, for instance, of the Maldives, cemeteries that hold the ancestral founders of Islam in the island nation, or in Zamboanga, in Santa Cruz Island. Even the cemeteries are under threat from rising sea levels. We face oblivion, erasure. Even the dead will not be spared. And so when we talk about climate change and the climate crisis, we cannot just simply talk about trauma and pain, however much that's in the center of things. We need to talk about hope. We need to talk about dreams, frustrations, but also the big fight, because we are going to be in the biggest fight that we've ever faced. If you can go to the next slide, we talk about hope, we talk about dreams, and when we talk about both of them, we cannot just hope and we cannot just dream without also thinking that we cannot be free unless peoples like Palestine is free as well. And so I end my presentation with a simple call again to remind everyone, Palestine must be free and the occupation must end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Red. The next speaker is a friend of mine, a lawyer as well. She has been engaged in environmental law and policy practice for over 3 decades. She has managed several foundations and organizations for the conservation of the environment, built local consensus on important policy decisions affecting natural resources and habitats, particularly in protected areas and wetlands, and published numerous works in these fields while working in various nonprofit organizations and their projects. We have a plan to write a legal book on environmental law, but that was 5 years ago and we're still procrastinating. She was designated as Undersecretary and later Regional Executive Director at the Calabarzon region of the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. Yeah, that's correct, right? In 2021, IPAT is currently an independent consultant for various government policy initiatives and is a naturalist, a native tree enthusiast, a bird watcher, a sourdough baker, and a trained rescue diver. I asked her, what are you going to talk about? And she said a lot of things. And I said, okay, just take it away. Attorney Ipat Luna.
Thank you. Magandang umaga, maraming salamat. My name is Ipat Luna. I did community-based environmental law work for 2.5 decades, focused on teaching environmental and land laws and strategies to communities threatened by eviction and ecosystem collapse. I then spent 3 years in the Environment Department and 2 in the legislature, trying to make sense of the intersections in governance, conservation, and climate, dealing with my own climate grief. I have never been to a COP, nor have I published anything relating to climate. My climate knowledge came from books, starting with Bill McKibben's The End of Nature in 1989, where he mentions rice as a major driver of climate change. When my father died in 2020, I had to take over the management of a 10-hectare family rice farm south of Manila, then under conventional farming using pesticides and a lot of water. I converted the system to SRI, or the System of Rice Intensification, which reduces carbon emissions up to 40%, with carbon emissions reductions in real terms up to 2 tons per hectare per year. The only climate communication necessary was to the potential buyers of carbon credits. For the farmers and the community, it was economics. More robust crops with longer root systems and less water usage. If climate change has scary feedback mechanisms across systems that threaten to overwhelm nature's cycles on which agriculture depends, climate action also has a feedback loop, a positive one that multiplies benefits. Hands-on climate action was exhilarating, even as we also planted endangered native trees in half a hectare by the river for biodiversity, water management, increased biomass, and further carbon capture. The objective of communication, after all, is behavior and systems change, from what harms climate to what mitigates. Even with a low footprint for our country and a focus on adaptation, the mitigation impact is measurable. The uptake of the farming practice in 30 more hectares of land around the area was very satisfying. Climate action that is not labeled climate action cannot be attacked or subjected to misinformation about climate or to funding slashes for climate finance. We can only know what makes climate communication succeed if we know how it has failed and how it has continued to fail. Sorry, I did not say next slides, please. I'm 3 slides in. Wait. Okay. 1 slide back, please. Here. The first slide was an AI-generated volcanic eruption. And I took a picture with my students, environmental law students, of the fiery sunset in Taal Lake. And people were alarmed because they were seeing the AI of the volcanic eruption and thought I was exposing my students to a volcanic eruption in progress. So these are the dangers on climate change communication. We all know about manipulative communication. This photo, climate discourse and therefore climate financing is threatened by this, an overhype also that reduces other actionable problems into climate ones, and therefore a resulting helplessness. The first we all know about, they are well-funded mechanisms by the carbon majors to engender doubt that there even is a climate crisis. The second sets up climate as a straw man. If you can blame it on climate, there isn't a need to do anything locally because it is hopeless after all. Consider a community that is flooded most of the year, blaming climate change when the real reason for their woes is over-extraction of groundwater and the resulting land subsidence. It is easy to put the blame elsewhere as it removes the imperative to fix a broken local system. Existential threats, after all, cannot be solved locally, or could it? Helplessness and hopelessness then sets in. Next slide, please. In law and policy, decisions and behaviors are frequently trade-offs. We often hear of a balancing of interests as if there isn't a twin major existential planetary crisis. There is a test frequently used to determine whether an action or decision passes muster. It is called IROPI, where a proposed action or project must be stopped for reasons of overriding public interest. That is the OP in IROPI. Well, if applied as a whole and globally, then overriding public interest should keep all remaining fossil fuels in the ground. The reality, though, is that decisions made in law and policy are one-off, case to case, just for that moment, and not on planetary scales. I propose that we have to look elsewhere to determine why we are making such a mess of it in terms of decisions that go against our own interests. I look to Tinbergen, a Nobel Prize-winning scientist in the field of animal behavior. He asks 4 questions about traits of behaviors in order to understand them. And recent developments in his field, called ontology, suggests that as members of the animal kingdom, perhaps the same question should be asked of us to understand why we continue to do this to ourselves and push ourselves to a planetary precipice. Are we evolutionarily equipped to ignore inconvenient truths? Is this a matter? Next slide, please. Ay. These are Tinbergen's 4 questions. I invite you to look at them and ask yourselves these questions when thinking about the decisions of our global leaders. Next slide, please. Or is this a matter just of tragedy of the commons, where all decisive action to prevent collapse is either not done or put off for later for lack of a management of the commons, lack of a governance mechanism? David Sloan Wilson, in his book, This View of Life, suggests that Tinbergen's question should be the lens through which to test policy decisions, and that survival of the fittest does not apply to individuals of the species, but to small groups of that species. If we fail to make climate communication permeate the consciousness of a critical mass among us, multiple small groups, and especially those that make decisions, is there hope for the planet? In the context of the Philippines, I would like to believe that we as a people need not know in our heads that our behavior would need to change. On a cellular level, we are recognizing planetary limits, like other animals. In Filipino psychology, next slide please, the notion of kapwa may just be the small group evolutionary response that we need to engender acts and elicit evolutionary responses for the survival of the race and the survival of all the other biodiversity that we are threatening. So to conclude, perhaps we need not even communicate climate change consciously at all. We just rearrange the systems to create an architecture of choice that inevitably leads to survival mode. We trigger these responses by generating awe of nature, economic advantages for climate-friendly systems like shifting rice agriculture, giving people healthier choices in food, making communities more cohesive and resilient as small groups, as Marge does. But in the end, it is government that has to establish the big group systems that will fully turn the tide. We continue to hope that our mass evolutionary responses will reach a critical mass and move governments, because of the multiple small groups, to making the right choices. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for many questions if you have any. I feel anxious now. I don't know how many more hours before the world blows up because of the consequence of climate change. Maybe I should sign up for a trip to Mars. What do you think? Any questions? By the way, there is translation happening right now, simultaneous translation in English and in German. So there's a gadget there that you put in your ear, something like that. Any question? I have a question for Mr. Red. You said that there is a need for hope, and every time that a friend tells me that I need to hope because I have a problem, I always say, what is the basis of my hope? So what is the basis of our hope?
There's plenty of sources for hope. History gives us so many to count. But also I think hope begins with a proper understanding of the issue. My own community is at fault, is responsible for communicating climate change in a really horrible, stupid way. Over 20 years ago, I already heard a number of people saying, advocates, campaigners saying, we have only 12 years. And then after a few years, they would repeat the same thing. It's as if climate change has a deadline and there's a cliff that you fall over. It doesn't happen that way. Because right now, for instance, we're looking at what the Paris Agreement calls a 1.5 degree threshold, temperature threshold, beyond which things become progressively more dangerous. But after 1.5 is not a cliff. If you think of yourself on a highway, after 1.5, the exit, if you miss that exit, there's another exit called 1.6. And then there's 1.7. It doesn't mean that things happen in an okay way. Because the farther and the more exits you miss, the harder it is to go back to the safe place. But the struggle doesn't end, even if you breach a certain fraction of a degree. And that in itself carries hope, because much of the climate issue is not about emissions per se, especially for countries like the Philippines, Like I said earlier, it's the biggest crisis the world has ever faced. It's not necessarily the most important. And the way to introduce climate action, to augment also what Ipad had said earlier, the best climate action is not necessarily climate action that prioritizes emissions reductions. In certain areas like the Philippines, 88% of families in the Philippines do not own their own cars. And transport is a major source of emission. Implement democracy in our streets and infrastructure and start building for the majority public transportation, you reduce emissions right away, but prioritize the needs of the working Filipinos. That has a lot of hope as well, because you run your campaigns based on what people need in terms of food, better jobs, better shelter, better infrastructure, and you get to solve the larger problem and you get to contribute more. So there's a big change that also has to happen among the advocates, the campaigners themselves, and they cannot do it without literature, without art. They will fail again and again and again. And so they need to integrate the works that Marge had spoken about earlier.
Thank you, sir. Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, so people in today's society don't really see the urgency to do something about global warming because of everything happening in today's world, with Palestine, Ukraine, and yeah, everything so became overwhelming. And caring about the climate crisis also means sacrificing living a more convenient life. So my question is, do you think using art as a form of showing the urgency in the issue, spreading even more awareness, will actually make the public finally care?
I have a supplemental question to that question of the young lady. What, in your experience, Professor Marge, what is the effect of the writing workshop in terms of caring more for the environment?
I think the first thing that you have to find out is whether they are even aware that they can write about their environment. So there's a mental shift that should happen, because in the usual way, the environment is used as a setting, like it's passive. But it is an active character in stories now. So that mind shift has to happen first. Once that happens, the ego is a little bit to the side. The speaking human consciousness is still there, but the one that is right there is the subject from nature. So, we do not say anymore, I wandered lonely as a cloud. That kind of metaphorizing puts the I in the middle, and the cloud is just part of that environment. There has to be that kind of shift. And when that happens, as I said, they create really fresh and urgent, a kind of urgent awareness that they are living with and they are part of that environment, not a part of it, no? Apart from it.
Let me continue that thread, because part of the reason we are not enamored, we are not in awe of nature, which will bring us back from the precipice, is because we've divorced humans from it. Environment is something out there, trees, clouds, etc. Therefore, I think art that not just depicts climate change, but gives us a certain awe of the things around us that are natural, will give that urgency, because there is a deadline to biodiversity, and it is extinction. For the Philippines, we have numerous endemic species because Luzon just came out of the sea 50 million years ago, and it had an explosion of different mammals and all kinds of things that are found nowhere else in the world. We have a very high level of endemic biodiversity, and those extinctions are going to happen even before we discover them. So we need to inculcate the generation of art based on an awe of our biodiversity. I mean, the dipterocarp species that only seed every 10 years or so, and their seeds are only viable for 2 weeks. What happens in those 2 weeks? There should be a rush to get these dipterocarps back in the ground and growing again, because we have covered all of the range of the dipterocarps by classifying it as arable land. Within this decade, there was a monitor lizard discovered in the Sierra Madres with two penises. Uh, they hate them. They hate when I say that, because you're actually raising a thing that is normal in monitor lizards. But that will open doors for people to start talking about these newly discovered endemic species, endemic even to certain mountaintops that act as islands. If we don't raise the science and depict them as art and inculcate awe of what we have, like partnerships between wasps and fig trees, only that wasp can pollinate that fig tree, and if you lose that wasp, which you never listed as endangered, you will also lose the tree. So those kinds of relationships in ecosystems, we need to enhance in order to tell stories, in order to get people to look at these as deadlines, because their extinction may be inevitable if we don't study them, if we don't measure them, and if we don't depict them as art.
Nick, can I add very quickly?
Yes,
Yeah,
for sure.
I think it's education and awareness is very important, especially literature. But we need literature to serve as fuel for an insurgency against the incumbency of fossil fuels. We need to make more trouble. And you cannot just educate and expect people to just carry on with their lives. That is where science and policy comes up short. You need to move people to inculcate a deep sense of agency, knowing that their past has clues to why there's so much inaction now. Ukraine is in its position right now because the horrible leaders in Russia are after a resource that compels them to invade and annex what is not theirs. The Middle East is full of strife for many reasons, including the occupation of Israel, but climate change has a very deep role in fomenting the Arab Spring in Tunisia, in Syria, all the murderous slaughters taken advantage of by the dictators in the region. Things are all tied up. And so we cannot choose one issue over the other. We must see the connections, but we also focus on the things because we need to win. We need to be effective. We do not win anything if we try to be an expert in everything and try to link everything and win them first before we go on to the others. If your campaign is about destroying toxic masculinity, you are contributing to the climate crisis fight, to avert global warming. If you're working on other things as well, you just need to see the bigger picture and carry on with what you're doing. But if you're not contributing to the insurgency, that incumbency of fossils will not be toppled, and we need to challenge it.
Another question.
Thank you for all your stories. I'm really inspired. I'm just because that last slide, Mr. Constantino, Professor, is really at the core of what I see as the problem now of the climate activists in Europe. I'm from the Netherlands, and I also participate in climate activism, and I always call it climate justice activism. And I always put social justice. And actually, it's a very white movement. Well, I'm now in a white country. But then I miss that colonial perspective. And we are also a small group of activists. We call ourselves Rebels of Color because we want to put that colonial perspective in that whole climate justice activism. And it's really very hard, and sometimes I get already frustrated. But then that's my play field because I'm there. I'm just wondering, because we're talking about reaching out to policymakers, if you also have efforts to reach out to these climate activists to impart because this is growing. But that's the problem. When Palestine 2 years ago broke with October 7, many of us, some of us of that climate activists demonstrated against that. But then the other activists, they said, no, 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 that's nothing to do with climate. So it even caused people to move away because that's not anymore climate. So that's how painful it is. But then I have no choice. I'm there and I have to participate. And I hope you could have some suggestions. What could we do to increase the narratives from the colonial part, the colonial narratives, because that is actually what we need. That's the playfield of my struggle at the moment.
Thank you for that question. Anyone wants to answer it?
One of the centers of the work that we do in the foundation is to tell as many people as we can, you cannot decarbonize if you cannot decolonize. And if you decolonize, you must decarbonize to complete the decolonization process. Because the colonialism, the colonization process is not over. It left a poison that is corroding our society and the source of colonialism as well. And we need to look at that right in the eye. I know what you speak of because I'm also part of a larger movement where our white colleagues live in the delusion that they can work on climate but not the other issues that are actually intrinsically linked. But we are many, they are few. And so we must proceed from a big tent, do not give in to what is also a horrible tendency of infighting and accusations that really serve no one except the big companies. There's a lot more out there. The mission of decolonization and decarbonization is far greater than the narrow minds of who you're dealing with. Unfortunately, you are in the Netherlands, but there's more of them than people like who look like us. But there's also a lot more allies out there as well. And maybe it's not necessarily one issue over the other. Palestine has always been a lonely issue, at least for them. For us, it's always been at the heart. But we can also talk about women, violence, the things that may bind us. We have to keep on searching for bridges. And again, the bridges will not be given by science and policy. It's only through the humanities and art.
Which brings me to ask, is there a category in literature that will encompass this creative writing system that we are trying to promote?
Well, I think you're talking about the market. It used to be literature and the humanities. Now you have all of these categories that have something to do with selling a product, like ecofeminism, ecofiction, and so on and so forth. I think we have to look at the language again and say, which is it serving? They sometimes call me an eco-feminist. So those are two labels that are given to me. But even before I got that label, I was already writing the way I write, right? So there's something that happens in your environment where you are categorized as a product and your art is materialized and again treated like a product in the market. I'm sorry, we are in a market now because we are in the book fair, but more than the market should be the exchange, the ideas that cut across languages and cultures. I think literature, the categories may be useful to some extent, but may not also be useful in many other occasions.
Nick, this is because it's also the curse of the academe. Because why, since when has poetry not been enough? I find it ridiculous that you attach 3 letters, eco, to what Merly Alunan or Marjorie Evasco would write. It's always been poetry, and they've always had ecology in the center. But the academe probably needs to sell itself again, and so they attach the eco thing, and it's ridiculous. But you need more poetry. You don't need more eco poetry. You need more poetry.
It's the same as the previous one, ethnomusicology and musicology. It's others, othering.
Yes, we have one more question until the time is up. The young lady over there. Yes, I was referring to you, ma'am.
The one thing that art can do and the one thing that literature can do is to give voice to nature. The shift of our point of view, instead of writing about the human being, we humanize nature, and the artist can allow us to hear nature speaking to us, nature telling us. Art can shift our point of view, and we are not we will no longer be hearing about, the human, as Marge is saying, I wandered lonely as a cloud. That's pointing at the human in relation to nature. But if we shift the view, if the artist can shift our view from the human in relation to nature, and put nature, give nature a voice and let nature speak to us and see how we have sinned against nature, in such a terrible way. And we owe nature so much. The artist can do that. The artist can sing about it. He can paint it. He can recite poems about it. He can chant, And then we will not be hearing ourselves anymore. We will be hearing a tree. We will be hearing the rocks falling from a mountain. We will be hearing the streams complaining as the water dries up. The artist can do that. And that is the power of art, because it's free. It's no longer bound by the usual consciousness with which we all grew up. It will be the consciousness of nature that we will be seeing. And I think that is what Mr. Constantino is saying. But we need more poetry, because poetry and literature and the arts can shift the way we look at the world. A world which is no longer centered on the human, but a world in which the human is only a part, not the ruling part, but the part that belongs to nature, and nature is really the God that holds us all in his hands.
Thank you very
in
much.
her
For
hands.
that.
Thank you very much.
It can also be generic. That nature, if you do not immerse yourself in it, you might be telling too generic a story, even if it's creative and artistic. But what I'm saying is, if science and policy fall short, then immerse yourself in nature and in the science of nature, because these are where the stories lie. We write about ourselves because that is where the stories lie. But there is so much story that can be told about nature, especially the Philippines.
Professor.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that in terms of specificity. I think you can write better literature if you have the specific names, for example, of the species that you are talking about. So one of the things that I do with my classes in the Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing is to have my students have a vocabulary check. How many species can you name by sight? Like not saying tree, but saying that's nangka, that's jackfruit, that's mango. Just recognizing the way the tree is standing there and being there. You'd be surprised. Many would just say tree. But what kind of tree? And then they would say, they hadn't connected with trees yet that way. So you need to do a lot more work, I think, with language.
Very, very quickly. When, absolutely 100% po. When you give voice to nature and when you listen to nature, your sense of time changes right away. Maybe gradually, maybe more quickly than others. Then you realize that the super typhoons, for instance, that you meet, that super typhoons make our headlines. But what is history to humans is merely current affairs to nature. The super typhoons that slam our country is because of emissions we failed to prevent 30 or 40 years ago. Nature proceeds in a different time scale. And humans, especially Filipinos, can only think of 3-year electoral cycles or at most 6-year medium-term plans. And it's completely crazy. You have to think of different layers of history, geologic time and human time. It makes you smaller, as it should. When you hear that voice and you just start speaking the voice of nature, you find your place, and your place is tiny. It's glorious, but it's very small, and it's nice there.
Wow, that seems like the unified theory of climate change. But our time is up, but I see a hand being raised there. Director Cora Alvina. This is the last question to give way to the next program.
Actually, it's advocacy of the devil a little bit, I think, because everything has been, wonderful to hear. Awe of nature. I translate it to my, shall we say, my concern. Awe of culture. It's like we're singing to the choir. How do we spread this news to the rest of, let's just talk small, the Filipinos. How do we tell the rest of the 31, how many million are we now? That this is important, that they should have an awe of nature, listen to literature, have more poetry, and heart to humanities, because as somebody said, it's a failure of humanities what we're going through now. How do we tell them? Ipat, I remember when we were doing Arroceros, and then somebody had taken down the High Alay building. So I was told, you people, the heritage people will not gain ground until all of these vendors and jeepney drivers care. I suppose it's what's happening now with the flood system. How do we make them care? How do we spread the word about literature and about nature? That's all.
May I? First, we have to let them tell their stories. Yes. We have to find a way to let them tell their stories. Just as we have to find a way to let nature tell its stories to us. Because nature does not tell its story in terms of words or in terms of images or paintings. We have to discover the language in which they talk and reach out to us.
Thank you very much.
They do.
Thank you very much. Because of the time constraint, we want to hear more about this discussion. I have to end this. Any final words from my panelists? And therefore, I am Nicholas Pichay. I'm thanking you for attending this hearing. This event, sorry. And with the powers vested upon me, I close the event.
Return to a land called Paraiso, a place where a dying river ends. No birds dare fly over Paraiso. No space allows them to endure the smoke that screens the air, the grass that's never there. And if I could see a single bird, what a joy. I never tried to take someone else's coins and live in fear like the rest of the world.
I live in this land called Paraiso, in a house made of cardboard walls and walls. I learned to be free in Paraiso, free to claim anything I see. Matching rags for my clothes, plastic bags for the cold. And if empty cans were all I have, what a joy. I never fight to take someone else's coins and live in fear like the rest of the boys.
Help me make a stand. Paraiso. Take me by the hand. Paraiso.
Make the world understand. Purify the seas, fill the world. What a joy to start a new wonderland. Let it spread some truth and hope and respect for the rest of the
Return to a land called Paraiso, place where a dying river ends. No birds dare fly over Paraiso. No space allows them to endure the smoke that screams